everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dan, and this is the Having Initiative podcast. Welcome again to this episode. This is basically mental health part 2. This one was big enough that I felt it had to be split into 2 episodes. And before going forward, if you haven't listened to the first, I highly recommend you do, because there are things that I established there that I will be talking about in here from time to time. One of which is I mentioned that there is the official clinical scientific establishment of what we know about mental health and psychology. And then there's the more commonplace pop culture influencer layman's understanding in the cultural zeitgeist that's going on. And that's not necessarily without its merits, but normally a lot is lost transferring between these two ideas. And I also mentioned with treatment a proverbial mom and dad approach. I'll reference that from time to time. And in the last episode, and just this podcast as a whole, I tried to talk about stuff that is really kind of separate from me. Like if there's a subject matter, and while I will give my, obviously anything that I put on here, I felt worthy of mentioning, so that gives some insight into me. I did try to talk about things that were separate, what people have said, ideas, things that have happened, that kind of thing. And in this one, I'm going to talk a bit more about my personal experiences and also my personal thoughts. I mean, everything in this podcast is my thoughts, so we're just going to go a little more in depth than we have before. So the chapters for this episode are disorders, mind over matter, and are we really trying to fix things? So here we go. Okay, so disorders. Now, these tend to be at the more severe end. I mentioned in the last episode that there's mental health is too wide of a blanket term, and there's a much more manageable end and a much more severe end. Disorders tend to be at the much more severe end. And I've mentioned that there are things that will, like someone says, I have my anxiety comes and goes. These things tend to be much more ever prevalent. And when I was in college, I took an abnormal psych class. And right off the bat, it was in the first or second lecture, the professor said, okay, we're called abnormal psych. What is normal psych? Quote, end quote. And no one had we hadn't really thought about that. And he said, I don't know if this was the established term in the field at that time, or if it was something that had been used, but he said, basically 51% of the population or more, or the majority, that is what is normal. So if 51% of the population does not experience something like OCD, then OCD is abnormal. So 49% of the population experiences OCD. Now, that's a thin margin, but it meets the definition of normal because most people, quote, unquote, don't have OCD. And he posited that if that switched per this definition, if 51% of the population had OCD and 49% did not, then OCD would be considered normal. So everyone has different experiences, and everyone has issues. Like I mentioned, most people, as children, we've experienced some kind of trauma, but there is this there is this desire to categorize things and understand them, and to do that, we kind of have to reference what is normal. People have said, there is no normal experience, but at the same time, as I mentioned with OCD, not the majority of the population does not experience that. So something to bear in mind with disorders is that, generally speaking, they are in the minority of the population, and that's why they are considered abnormal. Hence the term disorder. You are out of order. Now, there's a couple of, I guess, severe things that you can experience, like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, agoraphobia, and ketosis. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast, you can have Asperger's syndrome or be on the autism spectrum. And on one end, you can be no one would guess that you have any deviation from the norm in terms of mental health. And on the other end, it is much more obvious, and people can be weirded out by the uncertainty of your behavior. And some of them can be seemingly much more bizarre. Now, just like with OCD and agoraphobia and like being catatonic, these behaviors vastly differ from the majority, and they're the big ones. And the extreme cases of these, I talked about stigma in the first one, how mental health, there is a stigma against it, most would argue. With these big ones, these are the ones that people largely associated with mental health issues. And as a result, since it was being blanketed in with, just occasional, heart palpitations or feeling flustered, it's prevented a lot of people from being open to getting help for themselves because they don't want to be associated with these things, because these things had been not only associated with severe mental health issues, they'd also been associated with being crazy. And while there are treatment for these more extreme things, there are a lot of people who have them that can't live, quote unquote, normally. And this is where the stereotype of a mental institution comes from. You've probably seen movies like this where, it's, white tile everywhere. Everyone's in white scrubs or gray scrubs. And it's a room full of people that clearly aren't well in the head. And that's where catatonic patients come to mind. They just, they're sitting there and an orderly has to come and wheel them around. And that's where the kind of stereotype comes from. And with disorders, they can have some kind of diagnosis, but with diagnosing mental health, there's a lot of overlap with things. And an example is PTSD is something that is thrown around a lot. But PTSD has a list of criteria that has to be met to match it. And while some people can present very strongly with several of them, they can be absent of the others. And one of them, I know for a fact, is the length of time that you have to be experiencing the other symptoms on the checklist. And so if you have all of them, severe issues, except for the time constraint, categorically, the doctors will say you don't have PTSD, but you can be suffering pretty much just as much as anyone else who has been diagnosed has. And of course, in the field of psychology, there is a lot of debate over all of these things. And I briefly mentioned in the last one that we can't see everything that's going on inside of a person's head. We observe their mental state from their behaviors and their self-report, that kind of thing. And we're taking this, I guess, these measures of humanity and trying to apply them to humans and trying to gain an understanding as we would, I don't know, masses of chemicals and chemical reactions. So these disorders are largely misunderstood by the populace. Because as I said, while these can be they can have extreme cases, a lot of them, like OCD, I know can be treated. I've seen it happen with people. But the extreme, most bizarre cases, those are the ones that people hear about how someone can wash their hands over and over until they're bleeding constantly because they have a fear of contamination. Or they have to do some activity 47 times because there's something specific about that number, and they won't feel right until they do it. Now, those can be treated. Now, there are some more severe ones that, to my knowledge, the prognosis isn't as good, but they can still achieve some sort of livable life. And so with disorders, it's this weird balance in kind of the cultural zeitgeist of how they're trying to destigmatize it while at the same time not truly understanding it or understanding them. And so if you want to talk about these, I'd recommend getting educated and preferably, the word empathy is thrown around too much in my case, but if you want a good understanding of them, maybe learn from a source that isn't leading with being empathetic. Just my experience. All right. And that brings us to mind over matter. Now, in the first episode, I talked about the proverbial mom and dad approach and how the mom approach, not necessarily it's hard to say. I do think people are turning to it too much and neglecting the proverbial dad approach because pretty much every mental health treatment these days that I see involve getting the patient to change things. And when I say getting the patient to change things, it sounds like it's their fault. I mean, like if someone is traumatized from a horrible experience, then yes, something terrible happened to them. But since something happened to them, a lot of people, and they're experiencing very negative symptoms and effects, a lot of people seem to want to get them into a state of comfort, and that involves a lot of accommodation. And basically, it's pointing the finger at that thing that happened as the cause, in which, while technically that may be true, the person who's experiencing the trauma, they have to start moving towards the world in a sense, instead of trying to get the world to conform to something that will make them comfortable. And that it's not just the patients who try that, it's the people who are being empathetic around them, who are trying to support them in a way. And that's what I mean by the dad approach is being neglected, is that people aren't being encouraged to start changing things on their end. And I had a therapist once who, she was very encouraging in a certain sense, but she was tough. She was not gentle. I mean, I felt comfortable talking. She made you feel like she was on your side and that there was hope, because there was. And she was good at getting me to share what I was experiencing or how I had been up to that point. And, or maybe I had bottled so much up that I could not share. I'm still not sure to this day. But she wasn't warm and fuzzy. That was never the vibe I got. She did have a kind of stern quality to her, but again, somehow she felt like you could share with her and that she wanted to help. And when it came time at the end of every session, it came time to what are we going to do. She she was kind of tough about it. She did not mix words, and she was very much at the end of the session the dad approach, and she was a mother. And she didn't tell me that. She never told me that I'm okay the way I am. She always said something along the lines of, you have work to do, but not like in a condescending, like you have work to do. It was much more, okay, going forward, this is your task ahead. Because during the session, while I'm talking, there was probably a lot of confusion and it's like a lot of, I don't know. And just like she didn't say, it's okay where I am. She didn't say like you're a wreck or anything, but she never said I'm okay with where I am, because I wasn't. I was a wreck. I was a wreck. And she didn't say, whenever you're ready, here's what we're going to do. She would say something along the lines of, this what you're experiencing won't change unless you start to make a change. And I've had several therapists in my life, and she was arguably the best. She helped me in a lot of ways. So maybe this experience has made me biased about the very much supportive, quote unquote, therapy that's being passed around. And it's not necessarily like, I have seen some therapists who are very much like, whenever you're ready. And to be fair, I read a book about death and dying by Dr. Kubler-Ross, and she said that there is no set time for grieving that is acceptable or most healthy. It takes as long as it takes. But at the same time, she also talked about stories of people who grieved for a very long time and missed out on a tremendous amount and regretted that. And so she was not really here nor there when it came to, okay, now it's time for you to start getting your stuff together, get over something. So in terms of mind over matter, like I don't think, because there's rumors about, when people talk about therapy, and like there was a stereotype of, with mental patients, electroshock therapy, or if someone was having constant migraines, they would cut the corpus callosum in the brain to stop that, and they don't really do that anymore. But the idea of therapy, they associate it sometimes with like physical therapy. While yes, someone in physical therapy will have to do exercises, but there's also kind of various forms of stimulation or icing that can go on. Someone else does something to the person recovering. Now, with mental health, to my knowledge, there's much less external things going on. It's always, even if it's like meditation is the therapy, like the doctor prescribes meditation, like you have to do meditation. No one can do it for you. And so the consistent pattern that I see is that only the individual experiencing the issues can change them. And as I've said before, people are in distress and they're seeking comfort, and perhaps there's a time for that. But actually taking action to change, whether it's reframing their thoughts or doing different actions when they experience something, if they try to do the therapy, it causes distress, and as a result, people are stuck seeking comfort and not getting anywhere. And one example I've seen is that while people are trying to destigmatize the term mental health and to talk about it more and be more accepting of people who are going through things, which is all great, a lot of people are using my mental health, quote unquote, as an excuse for things that are going wrong. And it's like, okay, it was my anxiety, or I've been depressed lately. And yes, these things are and can be debilitating to an individual and make life very difficult. But the way out of them is, it's easy to say this when you're not experiencing them, but the way out of these things is to, in many ways, get back on the horse, get living in a sense, instead of withdrawing from life. And of course, there's nuance with both of those, but people are throwing out the nuance from what I've seen. And when I first got diagnosed with some issues, I had bad things going on, behaviors, and those caused some nasty repercussions. And once I learned about my diagnosis, I could attribute some of them to my diagnosis, to what I had. But when I was diagnosed and I realized, okay, all of these bad things that you're feeling are a result of a mental health issue, and there's the hope of treatment, people have gotten past this, that was my objective. I wanted to move past my diagnosis. And while I had looked at myself and I had seen that some issues could be directly attributed to what I had been experiencing with my diagnosis, there were a lot that weren't. It was just nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes, and those were mistakes that you made. And it was just compounded with all the other things that made it seem like once I was diagnosed, everything made sense. And so, new issues that seemed to arise in my life after my diagnosis, there was one or two where I did associate it with what I had been diagnosed with. But even then, I had a bit of a honest streak in me that took a look. It's like, no, these don't quite fit the bill. It's something else. And at times that was terrifying, because having a name for your issues is it's an understanding in a sense, and that brings some measure of comfort. At the same time, I had to take a look because I wanted to get better, and so forth. I didn't want to blame my issues on my diagnosis. And so as time went on, I did that less and less, because as I started treatment and facing the issues that I had, things started getting better. And it's not that I felt good, it's that the anxiety or the depression or whatever, those symptoms eased. And so it wasn't that I felt good, it's that I didn't feel as bad. And that was such a relief. Doing the therapy that was prescribed, and facing and being honest with the therapist in therapy, and then trying to do the homework they gave me at the end, those were the things that healed me and made me feel like, okay, those terrible things I had been experiencing for years, they weren't the norm for life. They were the exception, and that there was a lot more to be had outside of them. And life was so much more enjoyable than blaming my issues on my diagnosis and using that as a crutch. And I'm not sure why, but I do see a lot of people blaming their issues on mental health, which that's not going to destigmatize, and it's not going to help anyone. So I kind of mentioned this with therapy or treatment in the last episode. And I obviously gave my views on, your mind over the matter at hand. Ultimately, you have to decide what you want to be, what goal you want to have with your life, and make it a good one, almost like a superhero aspiration, and ask, is your treatment or your therapy doing that? Is the way that you handle your mental health getting you there? And if it's not, then maybe it's time for a course correction. Now, that brings us to the issue of, are we really trying to fix things? And this really ties into what I had just been talking about with mind over matter, but hopefully I can differentiate them. So we've all heard the expression, some people love drama. And it's normally like when we're talking about people watching those awful reality TV shows that where people are just, this close to snapping, and then they do snap and they're at each other's throats and arguing. And it's very, very intentionally melodramatic. And there's some people who hate that and will never watch it. But there's some people that like sheepishly admit to liking to watching that. And maybe it's because on some level they do like drama because, as humans, conflict is natural. But outside of that, when we're talking, think of like classical tragedy literature, like Romeo and Juliet, sad story. A lot of people die and a lot of bad things happen that shouldn't. But as much as people remember these stories for the observations into human psychology, most people will argue that there is a kind of beauty in tragedy or suffering or enduring through them. Now, not when it's happening to them, but normally like witnessing something else. Maybe it's because they have to feel for someone else and that opens up something inside them. And I've heard some psychologists talk about how humans are like we tell stories, and some of the stories we tell are tragedies, and they're not solely cautionary tales. Sometimes they are just we're just drawn to that tragedy. And maybe if someone else is experiencing something awful that we've experienced, we have a shared experience with them, and we can be drawn to that. Now, with that note of some people love drama, that opens up the question, if people love drama or tragedy and mental health can be debilitating, I wonder if some people, as much as it can be debilitating, love the struggle, love the tragedy of these situations. And so, a quick pivot. Someone once said, people have been trying to, normalize mental health and be more open about talking about it and not make it a hush hush thing. But someone responded to that notion that said, I don't think mental health is being normalized. I think it's being commercialized. And this is more in the kind of cultural zeitgeist aspect. And there have been things that have come out of Hollywood or Broadway that claim to present or discuss issues with mental health. Now, a lot of the times with these, I've seen that they don't really do anything resembling addressing mental health. They just used it as a plot device for conflict, because any narrative needs some measure of conflict. That's kind of essential to just storytelling. So they weren't dealing with mental health. It was just a means for drama, that tragedy, those character dynamics, the obstacle to overcome. And a lot of those things that deal with mental health, some of them claim to be an enlightening kind of pick me up, if you will, for mental health. And they had a lot of empty, feel good sentiments about them. Things about how, you're not alone, or you are loved, or you are valued, and you can feel better, you can thrive. And those things, those are good ideas, but they were used in a way that didn't really address, first of all, the way they portrayed the mental health issues weren't good. They weren't accurate if they gave names to the things, which is why they tend to not give names to mental health issues. And it was, the solution provided was just saying those things, but dealing with these things are much more complicated than just saying the right thing. And again, it was played up for the purposes of drama, the resolution to the struggle. That's what the empty feel-good sentiments were, like the categorical nature of a story structure. That was the end, the denouement, the resolution. And a lot of those entities have been criticized for basically commercializing mental health, trying to um, use people's generous sentiments about wanting others to thrive or feel better as a means to sell their product in a way. And they defend their criticism with the argument of, well, we are exploring these issues. We are a mainstream production with a platform and an audience, and we're using that platform and our audience to spread this important message. And if it's not a message, then at least get conversations going. And maybe some people had good intentions on those projects, but good intentions don't necessarily yield good results. Good intentions don't automatically mean that you understand what's going on. And my emotions might be a little cynical about some of those things, particularly because, like, as I told you, I was diagnosed with an issue. I've seen that issue portrayed in TV and film, and they clearly had no idea what they were doing. And both with how it actually happens, how it is treated, and then how the people walk away and never have to deal with it ever again. And so I might be a little cynical about it, but some people I've seen have been very passionately angry, particularly about saying you wanted to destigmatize it, but your motivations weren't pure, even though you think they were. And as a result, you have actually made the stigma worse. And one example, I have to be vague, unfortunately, with them and about some of the terminology because some of these words can't be used on YouTube. There was a production about a student who self-terminated. So hopefully you can extrapolate what's going on there. And as a result of that, in the play, as a result of that, people started talking about, like, we should have been nicer. We should say that we love each other more. We should just kind of, they attributed the person's self-termination to a lack of being nice, essentially. And the person who took issue with this production said that it is way more complicated than that. And the person who said this said she lost a loved one and she wished that saying the right thing was enough because the person was a suicide risk, and the therapy involved, or it wasn't so much therapy, but the kind of protocols for going forward with a person like that was, here's what you got to do. And most of it didn't involve, saying you're loved or whatnot. And that's a very complicated issue. And I want to iterate that the person's objections and mine and a lot of other people's aren't so much that that these things shouldn't be talked about. It's just that the entities that are talking about them don't understand them, and they aren't really going for improving understanding. It was just a tool for telling a story. And like, I want to clarify something that I said, that I've been talking about productions that have portrayed these things, that there have been public figures who have self-terminated or done something or had some other problem happen to them. And automatically I see unrelated social media posts about people who knew that person or looked up to them doing things about, you are loved, and you're not alone, you can talk to people, that kind of thing. And I know for the most part, a lot of those people do mean well. At least the ones I've witnessed, I know the people and I know them. And so I know that they mean well. But there wasn't an effort to actually understand. There was the assumption that if someone self-terminated, they must have been depressed, and maybe they were, or they must have been sad and lonely, and maybe they were, and they must have felt like their life had no meaning, and maybe they did. But it's much more complicated than all of that. And the kind words and the love, that won't fix the issue or address it. So to clarify, I do believe most people have good intentions with these, although maybe not production staff in movies and Broadway shows. But a part of me is saying, if you really care, why didn't you make the effort to truly understand? So sorry if I might have offended you unintentionally. I don't know you, so that was not my intention. Okay, now with notion of, are we really trying to fix things? There is this mental health, I've noticed, can be a source of identity. I mentioned shared experience before. how someone who is going through something, you might have experienced that, and that can make you feel closer because you have something in common. And so, in that sense, I've also noticed that people who get can put a name to what they are experiencing, like mental health issues, like specific disorders or my anxiety or depression. I've noticed at times the way that they come to terms with that by talking about it, it's almost as though they say, this thing isn't a negative, dealing with this thing doesn't make me weak, it makes me strong. And other certain phrases like that, that kind of give me the vibe that the struggle with dealing with these things makes these individuals special, because oftentimes low self-esteem is accompanied with all of these, and a lack of self-efficacy also goes with it. And so by having a name to their struggle and dealing with it, that makes them the hero of their own romantic tragedy. It makes them special and not forgettable. And so, as I said, some people are drawn to drama, we are drawn to tragedy. Their life, by having to deal with this, suddenly has more meaning than just being a normal person who doesn't have mental health issues. And there's a phenomena in psychology. I told a story, which I'll tell in a second. And the therapist said, okay, that phenomena is called secondary payoff. People can be doing some sort of behavior that is detrimental to them, but there is some sort of payoff that makes it worth it. That maybe might not be so obvious. So I read this in a self-help book. The author said when they were younger, they knew a guy in like high school who was, a decent kid, nothing too bad about him. And his parents were, loving, but they were also very successful and high achieving. And they committed a lot of that. And once he went to high school, the kid didn't need as much hand holding, so everyone was working. And one day it came out that he had developed a drug problem, and his parents were notified. Or maybe they discovered, one of the two. And they were very supportive. They didn't, they weren't like, why did you do that? They are like, I'm sorry that you're going through this. We want to help you. We'll be here. We'll do whatever. They started taking time off work. They got him all the therapy he needed. They were very supportive and like spent a lot more time together. And he got better. And so after a while of getting better, they started going back to what they were doing before. He's good. He doesn't need us to hold his hand anymore. And again, they loved him. There was no sense of neglect in that regard. They never expressed negative emotion about having to spend time with them. But when they started going back to work, eventually he relapsed. And the loving parents they came back to help him. And I forget how many times this pattern repeated itself, but he would keep relapsing and they would keep coming back to spend time with him. And then eventually he relapsed and he overdosed and he passed away. And the moral of this story was that while the drugs were doing a number on him and he did not like being in that state, he did like the attention that his parents were giving him, because since they were high achieving and whatnot, there was less time together. And I don't know what was going on with his social life, but apparently his parents' attention was what he wanted most. So much so that when he found that he was on drugs, they came running. And so I've seen a lot of people with quote unquote dealing with mental health. I question if they are actually making things better, or they're trying to make things better, because not necessarily from attention with others, but in their own view of themselves, their struggle gives them an identity that is more than just a normal person. And so I've mentioned when I was diagnosed with an issue and how I didn't want to blame all of my issues on that diagnosis or my mental health, but I've seen a lot of people doing that. There was another thing going on, which is that I was miserable. And as soon as what I had been experiencing was given a name and they explained the symptoms, the pathology of it, and so much of it lined up, and it's like, okay, yes, I believe your diagnosis. It makes sense. And when I was given the notion that recovery is possible, you can feel better, you don't have to be bogged down like that, that what you were experiencing is not normal and you can change it, I didn't want to be the guy with mental health issues. And it wasn't so much a shame thing. It was that I wanted to feel better. And when I started doing treatment, and again, I didn't feel good, I just didn't feel as miserable. That was a huge relief. And it was a motivation to want to get out of where I was. I didn't like the treatment was a pretty heavy part of my life at that time because there was a lot to learn and a lot to do. But there was this thing in my head saying, I don't want to deal with this anymore. Not because I want to give up and just wallow, because I want to overcome this thing. Because I had seen that with the issues I had missed out on a lot. And I didn't feel good about that. I felt miserable. But there was the hope of, you can be happy or you can be free of these things. I committed to the treatment. I got a little better and I wanted to keep going and feel better. And so I do see a lot of people say how these things are an issue and how they have a negative effect on their life and how they are struggling to do them. But I don't see a lot of the same passion. It's almost as if, because my diagnosis, it's something that I can live above, but I can't ever eradicate. And at first that was, scary, but over a decade has gone by since my diagnosis, and I found that I can manage it just fine. It's something I have to deal with a little bit, but it's not that bad. Once I got to a certain place, that is. But I see a lot of people with talking about mental health that don't have that same passion to want to be quote unquote free of it, because I'm not free of it. It's just easy to manage. I don't see the drive to want to heal. They say they want to heal and they want to feel better, but I don't see their actions reflecting that, because I see so much of blaming it on the anxiety. And they've accepted that this is part of their lives, which you have to do to an extent, but it's like they've accepted it in a way that means that this will always be a problem, as opposed to this will always be something that's there but can be dealt with. And something, because I hear people talking about it so much, particularly people that claim to have improved, they still talk about it so much. And I don't want to talk about it, not because I'm ashamed or not because I don't think it shouldn't be talked about, but life is so much more interesting than my mental health issues. Okay, when you're not feeling depressed and anxious all the time, joy and actual experiences, because life can be hard without all that stuff. I don't need to be, crippled with misery and dealing with the normal hardships of life. And so when we're talking about it, I don't see that drive to not want to talk about it. Again, not because out of shame, but because they want to live above and beyond it. I want to live as if I have no issues. And so that's kind of wraps up my views on, are we really trying to fix? I do see a lot of behaviors that make me question the people who want to destigmatize it. Are they really trying to fix the issue? So wrapping this up, I had an idea about trauma and I was going to mention it here, but it kind of lends itself better to another episode. So you'll hear that in the future if you choose to keep listening. And I noticed that I was kind of repeating myself a bit with this, but my apologies on that. But at the same time, there's a lot of overlap and it's hard to tell where one phenomena begins and another ends. So thank you for bearing with me and listening. And that pretty much wraps up this episode. Thank you again. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Thanks, everybody. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me. So this was part 2 of mental health, and when I was putting these 2 episodes together, I had a lot of things I wanted to say, but I didn't know how to organize it, so I did my best. And then I found with the first episode, it was almost like just laying some groundwork before getting into the real meat, which is what this episode was about. So if you've made it this far, thank you. And this episode, it was one of the most important ones to me because I see people talking about mental health a lot and wanting to make things better, which is great, but I do see things that are concerning me. So that's why I wanted to put this stuff out there. So, if you like this episode, please like or comment and share it with your friends. If you want to support the channel, again, like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell. It really does help. And thank you again for making it this far, and I hope to see you next week. Take care, everybody.